So this is kind of be the cursory of the rest of chapter 10. So the one thing that at first I hated and now I love about MVC is its ability to go in and create these CRUD screens for you. Stuff that's always a pain in the butt. It's always the thing I want to do last whenever I'm building an app is the management admin screens of just the basic mechanics of create an item, edit an item, delete an item. It's like I'd rather go into the database and do it, and then finally I get to the point where I'm tired of people emailing me to go do it in the database for them. So then you go and you build them out of just the need to get it off your plate. So the approach to creating these CRUD screens is you start by adding a new controller. So if you have things that you want to build CRUD screens for, do it here first. Otherwise, it gets a little more finicky when you try to do it moving forward. So we'll build a controller. And I'm going to call this my product admin controller. Okay. And I'm going to do, let's see, I want to do a controller that does rewrite actions with views using the entity framework. I'm going to point it to my product class, my DB context, or my where is it at? EF. Where is it? EF product. Oh, thank you. And I wanted to use Razor. And I click Add. Visual Studios does some magic. I get a drink of water, cup of coffee, take my phone to the bathroom, whatever you want to do, you know. Give it a few minutes, and it basically churns through the entity framework context, your models, and will build for you pretty much all the code you need to do those screens. Starts off by building an index page, which if you remember back from the default settings for the router, index was the default. So there's some slight modifications we'll have to make, but we have index. It creates its own instance of our context for us. It will grab all the products as a list and return them to the index view. It does product admin details 5, so it actually builds a view for looking at the details of a particular item. Does a find on that item ID, make sure that it has one. If it doesn't, it does an HTTP not found, which is one of your result types. If it does work, then it passes back that product to the view, and then the view will render out that model. Create runs the create view. The create actually has two methods. There's the get method, which is the create screen, and then there's the create post method, which takes the new product that was completed on the view form, does model state validation, and then takes the product straight from the form and puts it into the EF context and saves it. There's no field mapping, there's no fancy voodoo that you have to figure out how to make it work. It just parses the form for you, sticks it in a brand new instance of the object, gives it to you, and then it stores it in the database. If you've ever had to parse form fields, even in a WinForm application, you got to take the fields from the text boxes, put them in the object, take the object, pass it to your repository or your utility class, and then store it in the database. This pretty much does it in one fell swoop. Pretty nice. Edit, same thing, takes in the ID. Edit then has a post method, which then receives the edited product. It looks up the product by ID, updates the state, and we'll get into that probably more next week, and then redirects to the index. The delete get goes through, finds the product, publishes it to the delete view, and we'll look at that in just a moment. And then there's the delete confirmed, which is another method that's called. This is an override of the action name. So the name of the method is delete confirmed. When you call the action, you're actually calling delete as depicted up here. But the difference between product admin delete 5 and product admin delete 5 here is that this is a get and this is a post. So you can actually handle the same parameters in different ways depending on whether it's a get or a post. And there's some very simplistic security elements to the gets versus the posts, and I'll go into those a little bit in a moment. And then you have the dispose, which this class most likely implements, well, the controller probably implements iDisposable. We're overriding the dispose method so that we can clean up our DB context. So if you don't remember what dispose is good for, when you have a class that utilizes unmanaged resources, database connections, files, streams, web service streams, anything of that sort, and you need to clean them up or close them or destroy them at the end, you implement the dispose method, and then that tells the framework when it does garbage collection to run through these tasks before it gets rid of your class to clean up memory and all of those unmanaged resources. By using the dispose function, it should close any connections. Okay, so in this case, by telling the DB context to run its own dispose, within that dispose implementation, it's relatively safe to assume that it is doing the connection closing. Okay. Yeah. Now, bad code writer doesn't do it, then obviously it won't close the connection, but that's the idea, is that you kind of can assume it. Best practice tells you not to assume that it will and to do it explicitly. Right. It's Microsoft's code, so I'm going to trust them versus something else I download. But that's right. That's right. And then base class, calling the base class's dispose method, passing the disposing argument. Okay, so let's see. So that's the controller. Under views, we now have another folder called product admin with a series of 5 views. So we'll just kick through these. We'll start with index. So index is our list view. When this renders out, let's actually do this. Let's do an F6. Good build, F5 to run. And we can kind of flip back and forth and see what does the HTML look like and what does the markup for it look like. Oh yeah, we don't need that anymore. And since we are using inject and we are doing the dependency injection, if you were really a big stickler on using that, you would probably want to go back and make some modifications to what was generated. You'd want to go back and put the dependency injection, and so it injects the I product repository, and that you'd modify all of those actions so that they're using the repository instead of using the EF context directly. But it saves you probably 80 to 90% of your code because it does the rest of it for you. It's probably mostly find and replace with a few other little pieces. You're not having to rewrite everything or write it all from scratch.
Is there a way to template it using, like, created a template and added that context to it? So you have using the product repository?
There, you would have to go through and actually do like a Visual Studio add-on to probably do it. You can't. There's no easy way to do it. Just, you know, tweak this, add that kind of a thing. If you're working on a very big project, and I've seen this with companies that have very large projects, just Visual Studio projects in general, they'll actually have a small team or a small group of people that do nothing but build add-ons for Visual Studio to help automate those types of processes. Where this is the way we build things, we want to have that consistency, so we're going to build add-ons that facilitate that within Visual Studio. Alright. So let's see, product admin /index. So this gives us a list of all our products with our add details and deletes. So let's kind of just walk through this. So very top we have index and then a link that points to the create action. So here's our index, here's our create action, action link, name of the link, the action that's being called. It's within the same controller, within the product admin controller, so it's just create. Table header, and then we see HTML display name for. The display name for it looks at the model that's bound to the view, and it expects a Lambda expression that helps it identify what to display. Okay, so let me kind of say that again and point out the components. Display name for looks for a Lambda expression to pass the model to. So it's going to pass, it's going to actually technically pass a product, but your model is a collection of products. It kind of it does that single item iteration. But what it's going to do is it's only going to iterate over the first item, pass it to you, and then you are then responsible for passing the property that you want it to display. And you're probably looking at it going, what's the big deal? At least that was what I thought when I saw it the first time. And I'll get to that in just a moment. So display name for price, display name for category, display name for description. So that's just the header row of the table. Then we do the iteration. So for each item in the model, item being a product, HTML display name for model item, item.name. This syntax confused the holy heck out of me when I saw it the first time. I was like, first I went, what model item? Where did it come from? I then quickly realized that model item was the parameter for the Lambda expression. It could be named whatever I wanted. Okay, I'm good with that. No big deal. The next thing I said was, why the heck are they calling item instead of model item? Any ideas? No. That was my thought too, and I was like, no, that's backwards. Item is the item in the for each loop. Correct. Alright, so that's a good starting point. You ready for how goofy this is? It totally makes sense and it's totally stupid at the same time. Alright, so this is the parameter for the method, right? So if we think about an actual method being written, the method would look something like this. It would be void something, and then we'll just say var model item, right? And then since the only thing preceding the arrow is what's returned, you're saying return item.name. That's the equivalent of what that Lambda expression is doing. Because this extension method requires a Lambda expression, and because this extension method is bound to the model, which is an IEnumerable, to conform to that requirement, it says, okay, pass the IEnumerable product into model item. Huh? But don't do anything with it. Don't do a flippant thing with it. Instead, use item from the loop and spit that back out instead. The first time I looked at this, I went, what?
Because the other Lambda expressions that we see when you have model item, you can see model item on the other side that is being used.
Right.
The parameter that you're
Right, and you see it above.
Yeah. Right.
Oh yeah, the first time I looked at it, I'm like, what?
Whatever, Microsoft.
Yeah, and that was pretty much what I finally guessed, exactly what I came up with. I was like, alright, whatever. Apparently, either you were too lazy or I don't know. This was somebody going, oh, you know what we can do? Yeah, that's pretty much what I interpreted that as.
Playing a mean joke with some other developer in the group to figure out what was going on.
Yeah, so if you try to put model item here, it'll blow up at you and say there is no property named name on the model item class. Or there's no property named name on IEnumerable is what it'll tell you. Because there isn't. So this is what this is basically trying to do here. So pass in the IEnumerable, completely ignore it, and return the name instead. Loop through that, and spit out every product name. So seeing that, if we jump back to our cart real fast, where I kept kicking through, how am I supposed to do this? Right? The equivalent to what they did there would be text box 4, model item, i.quantity. No, don't stop debugging. So then if we come back here and we do cart, which should still be empty, yep. We'll add the basketball to the cart, and there's the number 1 still the same. Okay, so you look at it, and now here's the difference. This is where things start to get different and start to get a little weird, is that because we use the text box 4 does a whole lot more to the HTML than what just doing text box does, which can be good and can be bad. So it generated a whole lot more markup. Before we just had input, name equals quantity, ID equals quantity, value equals 1, type equals text. Simple as that. Now it does input, data val equals true, data val number equals the field quantity must be a number, data val required equals the quantity value is required, ID equals I_1, name equals I.quantity. Type is text, value is 1. If we say 2 and do update, now it blows up. The parameters dictionary contains a null entry for the parameter quantity, not nullable type, integer. For method, redirect to route result, update item.
Declare it as an optional parameter.
Well, I don't want it to be optional. I want it to get the quantity.
Right.
Quantity is no longer quantity now. It's I.quantity. So you end up now with this. You're following what MVC is doing. You say, oh, they did it that way, so I'm going to do it that way. By doing it that way, you end up breaking the code that worked. So let's go back and look at this again and look at the overload options. So it has 6 overloads. Ideally, there's got to be something in here. So text box 4, first option is pass in a lambda expression function. We're going to pass in iShoppingCart and return an int. The int is inferred because we're already returning an int in I.quantity. We can then also pass in the same expression and pass in some HTML attributes. That's possible. We can pass in name and ID. We can force those. Pass in the expression, same expression, lambda expression, and a string format. Don't really need to worry about the format. Pass in the expression, pass in a dictionary of HTML attributes, pass in the expression, pass in the string and HTML attributes, and then another modified version. So the closest thing we can do to forcing the name and ID is to pass in some attributes to define them. So if we do new, ID equals quantity, name equals quantity. Guess I can leave that there. Let's see, did it take? I don't think it took. Quantity, name. So it took the ID, but it ignored the name. So the reason I'm showing this is not to say, you know, there's all these little magical tricks around the way you do things, but there's multiple kind of methodologies and approaches within MVC. There's the code it by hand approach, and that has its own set of liberties and restrictions. You have liberty because you can basically define any of your parameters, you can treat them however you want, you can do it however you want. On the other side is not so much as it's a restriction, but it's you're left to your own devices. You have to build all the mechanics. You have to do all of the work yourself. When you do things like the CRUD screens, and we'll continue through those, once you start down that road, there are ways to work through them if you want to get certain functionality, but often it puts you inside of a box to say this is the approach you have to take, and these are the functions or abilities that you're able to do. You don't get everything. There is a way to get this to work, and I'll be honest, off the top of my head, I've forgotten what the trick was. A buddy and I spent about a day and a half off and on trying to get this to work, and we finally got it to work using this syntax. And then finally I said, well, why don't we just do it the other way? So that was a lesson learned. I mean, it was a good lesson, nevertheless, but you know, you get into those moments. Sometimes you spend 30 hours working on one problem trying to get your database to connect. Which, by the way, when I was doing yours, Bill, put it right in the way it should have been. It worked perfect.
Did you do the data directory? You put the data directory?
Yeah.
See, I was just saying, when we were doing it, we fully qualified, but then we didn't try putting the data directory back in because our problem was in the namespace.
Okay.
That was what we ended up ultimately figuring out.
Okay.
The namespace thing.
Right.
But yeah, we never did try to put data directory back.
Okay. Yeah, I went in and did it. Worked perfectly. So.
The connection string?
Huh?
I mean, the connection string.
Yeah.
We set
I didn't try taking the namespace thing out. I was tempted to mess with it, but I just didn't get a chance.
Just to make sure it works.
I understand.
Then we'll start messing with your program.
So, all right. So, I wanted to show that just so you kind of get a sense of you've got these two different ways of approaching it. So we'll go back and we'll just do text box again, and we'll say quantity. Oh, shoot. There we go. All right. Now, so the same thing holds true, or actually I should take that back. So we get through, we go name, price, category, description. We're spitting all that out on the screen. Then we get to this last segment, HTML action link, edit, new, anonymous type, ID equals product ID. Does anybody remember or recall or catch why you do that there? Why do we do new item equals item dot, or ID equals product ID? What does that do for us?
Is that how it's found in a database?
Partially, yes. So you're kind of half right with that answer.
Instantiating a new object of that type that you're looking at. This is the index, right? It's the list.
This is the index. Yes.
So all it's going to make a new object of with that particular data in it.
No. I don't think so. I think with what you're saying and what you think you're saying is not what it's doing. Closer with the database piece. Okay, so this is the product ID. This is the ID from the database of that particular item.
Oh.
Okay, that's what item.product ID. Item is the same item up there. What this is saying is create an action link, make the text say edit. The action I want it to call is the edit action off of this controller. I want you to pass to this action a parameter. The parameter's name is ID, and the value is the product ID.
Which is equivalent to probably the primary key, right?
Exactly. My product ID property here is my primary key out of the products table. Details, give me the details. Call the details action, ID, product ID. Same for delete. What that does is that action link interprets all of that and in a pretty slick way. Let me go back to product admin index. Let me just get that out of the way there. Razor engine. I know it's down here and it's kind of hard to see, but it says, okay, ID. So it goes back and it looks at the route config and it says, okay, product admin / edit, right? And then it says, oh, it's an ID, so it's just going to say, in the route config, ID was the last parameter that could come before the slash, so I'm going to drop ID and I'm going to say /1. Simple as that. So, product admin / edit /1. Edit product 1. 2, 3, boom, 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 all the way down. So, we can click details, and it gives us a basic detail dump of this product. Name basketball, price $17.95, category basketball, description, no description defined. Back to list just takes us back to product admin / index. Edit takes us to product admin / edit /1. If we go into the edit, again, it works to parse our model and gives us the most simplistic, direct form to edit this product. So text boxes for everything. So some of the things to notice here is there's no designation that price is really a number. Do we want to validate that and make sure that it is a number? Description, we want it to be multi-line. So how do we go through and make these accommodations? On the view. So we'll close index, don't need that. Create, we'll get to in a minute. We don't need that, we don't need that, don't need that, okay. So this form is a submittable form, so it starts with the html.begin form. Then it has a series of methods for validation. Anti-forgery token, it actually drops a piece of HTML onto the form, or a piece of, it's an input tag, hidden input tag, that generates this forgery token. And what it's there for is to validate that your submission is your submission. That your submission isn't hijacked and then someone attempts to do a resubmit somehow using your credentials or something like that. So that anti-forgery token tries to work to make it unique. Validation summary is I don't know how to describe it. It puts a control on the page, or puts an HTML space on the page that is there for capturing all validation errors. So text box is required, you didn't fill it in, invalid date time format, whatever that may be. It says put the validation summary in this region, top of the page. spit out all the validation details. Field set's just a standard tag, legend's a standard tag. So then you start into these fors again. So the model for this product, one product. So we start with a hidden field, model product ID. So we're hiding the primary key in the submission. It's in a hidden field. We then have a div editor label, which doesn't really mean a whole lot, but it's there. And then it says HTML label for name. Generate a label for the name field. If nothing is explicitly defined, and we'll get into that in a minute, then it just assumes the name of the property is the name of the label. So name is name. Editor field is the actual text area that it's going to use for editing. Editor for name. Editor for is a very smart method. It looks at the data type and it attempts to provide you with the most accurate HTML control for rendering that element. So name is a string, it's going to give you a text box. Okay? If one of these properties was a Boolean, it would give you a checkbox. If you go in and you say this is a date time, and you provide it with the right kind of markup information, which we'll get into in later weeks when we start building custom views for elements. You'll say this is date time. It can spit out on the screen a date calendar selector for you. So you don't have to go in and put all that together by hand. You can say this is date time, boom, it always puts in a date time selector. So editor 4 looks at that, says put a text box with the name value. Validation message for if there are validation requirements on that field and you have the right JavaScript libraries and everything enabled, it will then spit out the validation message below the text box. On to the next one, price, label 4, same concept. Editor 4, same concept, validation message. Category, label 4, same concept, all the way through. We finally get to the very bottom. We have input, type submit, value save. Basic input, basic submit button. Last thing is action link back to list, returns to index. This is interesting to take note of. Scripts rendered, bundles, jQuery val. jQuery val is a jQuery subset library, or I should say it's a subset of jQuery that provides APIs for validation. So remember when we used the text box 4, we got all those extra markup, data val required, data blah blah. jQuery val uses all that extra markup to validate your fields for you. Probably about 2, maybe 3 years ago, Microsoft took a very strong interest in the jQuery library. So much so that they actually created a team within Microsoft that went through the jQuery library and made pretty substantial contributions to it to optimize performance, provide a lot of functionality, streamline consistency, a whole bunch of stuff. The reason they did that is because they needed a good JavaScript library for doing a lot of the stuff they're trying to do with their web development without having to invent their own. Why invent something that exists that works pretty well? They finally kind of got that idea. So they took a very strong interest and investment in jQuery, and some of the results of that are things like jQuery validation and a lot of the jQuery functionality being built right into the MVC framework, or MVC project templates. That's why you can go out and when you create a standard project, you get all of the jQuery UI, jQuery validator. I think there's even an extension that or a package you can download for jQuery mobile, which allows you to do MVC mobile applications. So jQuery val is just one of those pieces, and then all of these helper methods, these HTML extension methods, are all built in such a way that they but hook into things like jQuery validator. All right, so I rambled. So quick and dirty, look at the markup. You'll notice a few things that may be of interest. So let's just kind of walk through everything we looked at again, and you'll start to see the parallels. Form tag is the beginning of our form. Product admin, edit one. Method post. No validate equals no validate. So validation is not active. There's our verification token, hidden string of text. Field set legend, and then there's our input. There's our data val equals true, data val number equals the field product ID must be a number. Blah 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 blah. This is a hidden field, so ideally it doesn't matter. It shouldn't need to validate it unless it was messing with your markup. You move on. You have the editor label, editor field. So this editor label, if I expand it real fast, is just the word name. And it's the label for name. For name refers to this text box. It's a browser helper. Basically what that means is that if I come in here and I click on this label, it takes me into the text box. Okay. So field editor, there's the text box itself. Class single text box, single line valid. Name or ID is name is name, type is text, value is basketball. So it's the default value. Field validation, and then those are just kind of field validation extensions. You'll notice that there's nothing really in here aside from the action, and really even the action doesn't say a whole lot. There's nothing here that says, hey, this is a product. But edit/1 method post points to a method. Oh, wrong one. That accepts product. Okay. What MVC will do is when that post occurs, it will go in and it will create a new instance of product. Spin up a brand new instance of product. It will then go through every property of the product class and it will match them up to the fields submitted and attempt to fill them in using the data that was provided. Close that. So I'm going to put a space there and hit save. So here's our product class with all the values, including our space. So MVC goes through and does all that parsing for us, gets us in a good place, so that we don't have to do the parse. Now, if one of our field names does not match a property name, it will drop it. It will not include it. It will assume that there was a bad match, or there was additional form data that was submitted that wasn't necessary. That's often where you're going to run into problems, is that when you're expecting it to auto-populate for you and it doesn't happen, you're then going to have to start to dig through, what are my field names? What are my property names? Do I have bad matchups? Things like that. Okay. So that's just a word of warning. Second thing, and this will be the last thing and then we'll go, I want to make this text box multi-line. How do I do that? We could go back and we could change this from being editor 4 to text area 4. But we want to let the system figure out those details for us. So instead of modifying this, we can actually go back all the way up into our product class and we can make modifications and add what are called attributes. These attributes help describe methods and properties and classes and give them unique pieces of information to help us describe to the computer, to another piece of code, how to handle or treat these particular things. The editor will look for these attributes attached to these properties. So you think it's kind of weird. Why am I almost feel like I'm passing the property, not just the value, to the method. Well, the method is actually going to look at both the property itself and the value of the property and figure out what is happening and what it needs to do. So it's a very intelligent method for as simple as it is. And I've got the markup in here. I just want to.
What is it called? Required?
Huh?
Is it required?
Required is one of them. So let's say we want to go through and make sure that the price is in here. So we can say make it required. So component model data annotations is the namespace.
I think key is one of them.
Key of the product ID.
Right. Now, that is a data annotation from the entity framework side of things. What we're wanting to do is annotate it from the MVC validation side of things. And the one that I'm thinking of is
What's the data type of description of the database?
Huh?
The data type of description, is it just a var like 25 or 50?
I think it's 400.
I was saying, it's a var max. I thought it automatically turned it into a text field, like not a field, but a text area. HTML.
Oh, let's see what it is. I don't know if it can go that deep and figure that out. I could be wrong. It's been known to happen. It's 400. It's not max, but it's a pretty decent sized one. But doing data type, where's the freaking thing? Data type. All right, so it's data type dot multi-line text. When you decorate it with that attribute, we'll recompile, refresh. That's the hint that it uses to do that. So if we come in here and we whack the price and hit save, the validation occurs and it says timeout. The price field is required. No postback occurred. jQuery validation picks it up, gives it the nice red color, blah, 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 and then there's our validation message. And that's all simply inferred off of that one attribute being added. So by adding that attribute, we can kick through all this, but basically it's going through and it's saying input validation error, data val equals true, data val number, there's the message, and then data val required, the price field is required. And then this is the actual message that we're seeing. What I also think is kind of fun is that it puts for price here again. So the for is really a nice little piece of HTML, even if you're not doing MVC. Because what that does for you is, let's say that error was up here. The user can then just click on the error. Oh, well, it's not going to do it. Maybe it's a Chrome thing. The user would be able to click on the error, and then it would take their focus back to the text box of error. They don't have to figure out which one is it, blah, blah, blah. And it provides that jump. So that's a nice little kind of add-on to it. But again, that's jQuery. So there's really little work that I had to do. I didn't have to write a validator. I didn't have to make sure that calculations were being done, things were happening. It all happens right there. Now, since I put required here, jQuery validation happened. It blocked the submission. Does anybody know of a potential, not security issue, but something that could circumvent this and how we respond to it? So yeah, so if you put a space, it actually knows that that's a space. It doesn't take it. You put a letter, It says price must be a number. That's technically a number. No, still doesn't like 0.0. Turn off JavaScript. Turning off JavaScript in the browser, jQuery validation doesn't occur. It doesn't know how to check at that point. So put in whatever you want, you hit save, it'll cause the submission. It'll blow it up. That's why this model state is valid is here. What?
In theory, I guess in theory it would still allow it again, but
What?
well, we're thinking if the database doesn't, if you're allowing nulls, it's a nullable field.
Right.
You could technically allow, but
Right. So in order to do a nullable field, you'd actually have to make the property nullable, which numbers by design are not nullable because they're value types. But you can wrap them or make them nullable to facilitate that. The model validation is actually happening on the class itself. It's not going all the way back to the database. That's why you have to put the hints, the attributes on the properties in order to help provide that information. This model state that is valid, though, goes through and it actually will validate the model that the submission is mapped to. So as simplistic as it looks, it's actually, again, it's another one of these deceivingly very smart little properties. And it says, all right, a product was submitted, the data was in there. If for whatever reason the data in product does not match the validation requirements, i.e. price is required, is valid returns false. Is valid also will then cause that validation summary, that thing that was at the very top of our page, it will cause that to get injected with the error messages. Price is required, price is not, must be a number. All of that, that's where that shows up. So it's part of that model state validation process as to how those pieces are hooked together. Okay. All right. I'm not going to go through the work of turning off my JavaScript to show you. Because you probably want to go home.